What happens when a 35-year-old African president walks into a room full of world leaders and refuses to play by their rules? When everyone expects a plea for aid, he delivers a vision that could transform an entire continent. Today's story unfolds in the polished power corridors of Riyadh, where fortunes shift over quiet conversations, and one man's defiance upended the expected script. This isn't just about wealth or politics. It's about pride. It's about dignity. And what happens when someone dares to say, "We don't need saving, we need a seat at the table"? By the end of this story, you'll understand how a single speech in Saudi Arabia sent shockwaves through 3 continents and elevated one of the world's poorest nations into an equal partner overnight. The King Abdulaziz Conference Center gleamed in the morning sun, its marble floors reflecting light like mirrors. Outside, Riyadh's skyline stretched wide, glass towers rising out of desert ambition, built on oil, wealth, and vision. Inside, the air was thick with anticipation, the kind of electric stillness that only exists when the world's most powerful people gather in one place. It was March 15th, the start of Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman's annual investment summit. This wasn't just another forum. This was the arena where decisions were made that could reroute supply chains, lift economies, or collapse currencies. One handshake here could be worth more than an entire country's annual budget. The guest list read like a roll call of global influence: Silicon Valley giants, oil barons from Texas, European manufacturing moguls, and presidents whose policies shaped continents. At exactly 9 a.m., the Crown Prince entered the Grand Hall. At just 38, he had already reshaped Saudi Arabia's economy and launched one of the most ambitious modernization plans in the world, Vision 2030. He was here to decide who would gain access to the kingdom's $2 trillion public investment fund. By dawn, private jets had already stacked the runways at King Khalid International Airport. Everyone had come armed with flashy presentations, market forecasts, and bold promises: renewable energy, AI ventures, space exploration, smart cities. Everyone wanted a slice of the Saudi future. Among the expected faces, one stood out as an oddity: Ibrahim Traoré, the young president of Burkina Faso, a country many attendees couldn't find on a map, a nation with a GDP smaller than some delegates' hedge funds. Whispers echoed through the hall. Burkina Faso? Why is he here? What could he possibly offer Saudi Arabia? To most, his presence seemed symbolic, an obligatory nod to inclusion. Nothing more. But by the end of the day, those murmurs would turn into stunned silence. The morning unfolded in predictable fashion. One polished speaker after another took the stage. Smooth slides, practiced smiles, billion-dollar ideas wrapped in corporate jargon. The Crown Prince listened politely, asked sharp but measured questions, and offered vague nods of interest. Deals were discussed, but the energy felt cold. Professional, calculated. Then came the lunch break. The crowd dispersed into clusters, networking over espresso and mineral water. Saudi officials moved through the crowd like gracious royalty, warm but distant. And that's when Ibrahim Traoré made his entrance. No tailored suit, no entourage, no flashy slides. Instead, he wore his country's military uniform, simple, imperfect, and utterly unmissable. It wasn't a costume. It was a declaration. I am not here to perform. I am here to represent. He didn't push his way into conversations. He didn't hand out business cards. He simply stood, calm and observant, waiting. By the time the afternoon session resumed, most delegates were checking their phones and whispering about their next flights. Traoré was the last speaker. The room was restless, the applause lukewarm. This was supposed to be a footnote. And then he began to speak. He told a story. Not about GDP or infrastructure, but about a child named Moose, a boy who turned on the first solar light in his village. Not with foreign aid, not with World Bank loans, but with power generated through Burkina Faso's own agricultural reforms and mining efficiency. And when that first bulb lit up his home, Traoré said, pausing, he didn't smile, he didn't dance. He looked at his father and said, "Now we can study after sunset. Now we can build something." A 10-year-old boy. And his first thought was about construction, about creating, about the future. You could hear a pin drop. Even the Crown Prince had stopped scrolling on his tablet. Then Traoré began to walk the stage slowly, locking eyes with the crowd. "That photo," he said, "is why I came here. Not for charity, not for aid, but for partnership. A true partnership between nations that have capital and nations that have hunger." And in that moment, everything shifted. Because power isn't always loud. Influence doesn't always come from wealth. Sometimes it walks in wearing a plain uniform and tells the truth. He stopped directly in front of the Crown Prince's table. The room fell into a hushed tension as every eye followed him. "Your Highness," Traoré began, "you've spoken with vision and clarity about diversifying Saudi Arabia's economy, about moving beyond oil. You've made bold investments in AI, renewables, tourism, entertainment, all wise moves. But may I suggest, the kingdom's greatest opportunity doesn't lie in replacing oil with technology, but in replacing transactions with transformation." The boldness of that line rippled across the room. Delegates shifted in their seats, eyebrows raised. You don't speak that directly to Mohammed bin Salman, certainly not if you represent a country whose entire economy couldn't fund one of his mega projects. But Traoré wasn't finished. "Africa is not here to ask. Africa is here to offer. We are 54 nations, over 1 billion people, most under the age of 25, the youngest, most determined population on Earth, a continent rich in minerals, arable land, sun, wind, and ambition. But above all, Africa is still writing its story." He reached into his bag and pulled out a single tablet, the first piece of modern technology he'd used all day. With one tap, a map lit up behind him. The entire African continent, overlaid with dotted lines weaving across deserts and savannas. "This," he said, pointing, "is the Trans-Sahel Infrastructure Corridor, a network of roads, railways, power grids, and fiber-optic cables stretching from Dakar to Djibouti. 8,000 kilometers, 12 countries, the most ambitious infrastructure project in Africa's history. Not designed by foreign advisors, not drafted in Western boardrooms, but built, imagined, and engineered by us." The energy in the room shifted. Suddenly, this wasn't a courtesy speech. Delegates leaned forward. Phones were silenced. Notebooks opened. "The total cost of the project? $800 million, Traoré said calmly. "Less than the cost of one luxury resort in the Red Sea. But the returns? Transformational." He let the word hang for a beat. Imagine West Africa's agricultural surplus flowing seamlessly to East African ports. Imagine Saharan solar power lighting industrial corridors from Senegal to Sudan. Imagine a connected continent, where students in Mali research with universities in Morocco and data centers in Kenya link with labs in Cape Town. Now the Crown Prince was fully focused, leaning forward, hands clasped, eyes locked. "And here's why this matters to you, Your Highness," Traoré said, stepping back toward the royal table. "This isn't just about African development. It's about your position in the future global order. Every ton of cargo on that corridor could pass through Saudi ports. Every watt of power could use Saudi tech. Every telecom line, every railway signal could carry the mark of Saudi partnership." He tapped again. New slides appeared, trade flows, projections, economic timelines. Conservative estimates suggest a 400% increase in Saudi-African trade within 10 years. But more importantly, it would place Saudi Arabia not just at the center of the Middle East, but at the heart of three continents: Asia, Africa, Europe, connected by your vision. The data grew more detailed: charts, figures, graphs, but Traoré kept circling back to his central theme. Not charity, not aid, not patronage, partnership, mutual investment, shared transformation. Then came the line that stopped the room cold. "Your Highness," he said, advancing to the final slide, "every empire in history is remembered, not for what it gathered, but for what it built. The Egyptians built pyramids, the Romans built roads, the British built ships. What will Saudi Arabia build?" He paused, clicked off the screen, then stepped back to the center of the stage, alone. "I propose that Saudi Arabia build bridges, not just steel and concrete, but human bridges, economic bridges, bridges between the youngest continent on Earth and its most ambitious kingdom." Silence. And then, he did something no one expected. He closed the tablet, set it aside, and spoke, unaided by slides, microphones, or technology. "But I must be honest with you," he said, his voice ringing across the marble hall. "I didn't come here to ask for your investment." A murmur of confusion rippled across the audience. Crown Prince bin Salman tilted his head slightly, listening. "I came here to offer you something far more valuable than a business deal. I came to offer you a place in history." Gasps. The kind that slip out before you realize you're in the presence of something rare. Someone who believes what they're saying. Not as a kingdom that got rich from oil, but as a kingdom that helped others rise from their own resources. Not as a nation that bought influence, but as one that built it, through respect, through dignity, through shared growth. He paused again. Let the silence carry the weight of his words. The Trans-Sahel corridor will be built, with or without Saudi Arabia. We've already committed. We have Chinese partners, European interest, American investors. We don't need rescue. What we need, what we offer, is partnership. The room was stunned. This wasn't a plea, it was an invitation. "If Saudi Arabia chooses to join us," he continued, "you're not just investing in infrastructure, you're investing in the future of South-South cooperation. You're showing the world that wealth is not about what you own, but what you create." Then softly, but with complete conviction, he walked once more toward the prince's table. "Your Highness, Vision 2030 is bold, but imagine Vision 2050. Saudi Arabia not just transforming itself, but helping transform an entire continent. Saudi companies growing with African markets, Saudi students studying at African universities built with Saudi capital, African researchers working in Saudi labs funded by African minerals." It was a vision unlike any other offered that day. Not of dominance, not of dependence, but of shared destiny. And as he stood there, no slides, no stats, just one man's voice, something in the room shifted forever. Not because of what he asked, but because of what he dared not to ask. "This is why I came without a PowerPoint, without a delegation of consultants or glossy financial forecasts," Traoré began. "I came alone, one leader speaking to another, not to ask for money, but to offer partnership, a partnership between equals." He stepped forward, halting directly in front of the Crown Prince, close enough for their exchange to feel intimate, yet loud enough for every delegate in the room to hear. "Your Highness," he said, "I don't believe Saudi Arabia's legacy will be the tallest skyscraper, the fastest train, or even the most advanced AI system. I believe your greatest achievement will be this: proving that real power isn't found in market domination, but in market creation. That greatness lies not in controlling resources, but in cultivating them, not in buying loyalty, but in earning respect. Silence overtook the hall. It was either one of the most compelling acts of diplomacy ever witnessed, or an act of political self-immolation. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman remained still, unreadable. Tension hung in the air. Everyone in the room understood. This moment could birth a historic alliance or dissolve into diplomatic fallout. Finally, the Crown Prince spoke. His voice was quiet, but clear. "President Traoré," he began, "in recent years I've heard thousands of pitches. I've reviewed countless proposals, each one focused on what Saudi Arabia could offer. Our capital, our infrastructure, our markets, our influence." He paused, his eyes fixed on Traoré. "But you are the first to speak to what Saudi Arabia could become." He rose slowly, his stature commanding instant attention. Now addressing the full assembly, his voice carried more forcefully. "Ladies and gentlemen," he declared, "what we have just witnessed isn't a plea for help. It's a vision. President Traoré hasn't asked us to rescue Africa. He has invited us to participate in Africa's renaissance." The Crown Prince began walking around his table, heading toward Traoré. "This is precisely the kind of thinking that Vision 2030 was designed to encourage: mutual growth, shared opportunity, and genuine respect between partners." Standing just feet from Traoré, his tone shifted from formal to personal. "Mr. President, your Trans-Sahel infrastructure corridor represents not only a bold step for Africa, it reflects the kind of future Saudi Arabia wants to help build. Not out of charity, but because we see in Africa not a burden but a partner." Then came the announcement that shifted the room's atmosphere entirely. Saudi Arabia's Public Investment Fund will commit $500 million to the first phase of the Trans-Sahel corridor, he declared. Further funding will follow, based on transparent milestones and the active participation of partner nations. Audible gasps, murmurs. Heads turned. This was not business as usual. "And," the Crown Prince added, "we will establish a permanent African Partnership Office in Riyadh, dedicated to fostering South-South collaboration. President Traoré, I would like you to chair its advisory board." The offer was extraordinary. African leaders were rarely invited to co-design Saudi policy. Yet here was Burkina Faso's president being asked to help shape an entirely new platform for global engagement. Traoré gave a simple nod, but in his eyes was the weight of history. "Your Highness," he said, "this isn't just the start of a project. It's the start of a new kind of diplomacy, built not on dependency, but on dignity, not on charity, but on collaboration. Today, we begin to replace the donor-recipient model with something far more powerful: true partnership." The Crown Prince smiled, genuinely for the first time that day. "Mr. President," he replied, "I believe you're absolutely right, and I believe this alliance will benefit our peoples in ways we cannot yet imagine." The session ended with formal applause, but the real electricity was in what followed. Delegates from across Africa quickly approached Traoré, eager to understand how their nations could plug into this new framework. Western representatives recalculated their own influence on the continent. Chinese envoys quietly weighed the implications for Belt and Road. But it was the Crown Prince who sought Traoré out once more, away from cameras and microphones. "Mr. President," he said in a low voice, "what you shared today wasn't just inspiring. It was essential. Saudi Arabia has been searching for authentic, balanced partnerships. You've shown us what that looks like." Traoré nodded. "Your Highness, Burkina Faso has learned this. Dignity lasts longer than aid, and partnership, real partnership, is stronger than patronage." The Crown Prince extended his hand, not out of protocol, but as a symbol of something deeper. A handshake. Not of obligation, but of transformation. "Mr. President, I believe we've just opened a new chapter for our regions and for the world." Word of the partnership spread fast. Within hours, African stock markets rallied. Investors responded to the prospect of Saudi-backed infrastructure across the continent. Social media lit up with pride and anticipation. Clips of Traoré's speech went viral under hashtags like #TruePartnership and #AfricaRising. Global media reacted swiftly. Western outlets analyzed the geopolitical shakeup, questioning what this meant for Europe's waning leverage. Chinese coverage was wary, pointing out the implications for their own influence in Africa. Middle Eastern news hailed the move as proof of Saudi Arabia's ascending global leadership. But the most profound ripple came from within Africa itself. Within 48 hours, leaders from Senegal, Ethiopia, and South Africa reached out. Some to connect their infrastructure, others to invest directly. These weren't ceremonial calls. They were serious inquiries, born from a realization: the game had changed. Africa was no longer waiting for inclusion in global conversations. It had just invited the world to a new kind of table, and Saudi Arabia had accepted the seat.